For 50 years, she was the perfect wife, the silent partner, the living ghost in a mansion built on secrets and lies. They saw her grief and mistook it for frailty. They saw her age and mistook it for weakness. They called her a burden, a relic to be cleared out with the old furniture so they could start their new lives. They were about to learn that the quietest people are the ones who have listened the most, and that there is no force on earth more powerful than a woman who has nothing left to lose. Stay with us for this story of vengeance. Make sure to follow, like, and share this video, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single moment of the reckoning that is about to unfold. The air in the church was thick and cloying, a heavy perfume of lilies and hypocrisy. It clung to the back of Elizabeth Sterling's throat. From her seat in the front pew, the polished casket holding her husband of 50 years gleamed under the sterile light, a final, ostentatious lie. Richard Sterling, pillar of the community, philanthropist, captain of industry. The eulogies painted him as a saint carved from granite, a man whose only fault was working too hard for his beloved family. Elizabeth listened to the drone of practiced praise and felt nothing. Not grief, not relief, just the vast, hollow emptiness of a cage whose door had finally swung open. She was a statue of perfect widowhood, her spine straight, her hands clasped in her lap, her face a mask of serene sorrow that had taken a lifetime to perfect. Beside her, her son David sniffled on cue, his shoulders heaving with a sorrow that was theatrical and thin. He was a man drowning in his father's shadow, desperate to wear a suit of authority that was several sizes too large for him. And next to him, his wife Olivia, a master of the artifice, dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Her grief was an accessory, perfectly matched to her black couture dress and the hungry, calculating glint in her eyes that scanned the crowd, assessing the net worth of the mourners, tallying the assets Richard had left behind. Later, back at the Havenwood estate, the performance continued. The house, her house, felt alien, crowded with people who spoke of Richard with a reverence she found nauseating. It had never been a home, it was a stage, and for 50 years she had played her part flawlessly. Now, the lead actor was gone, and the supporting cast was getting impatient. Olivia glided through the throngs of guests, a hostess pouring wine and condolences in equal measure. She approached Elizabeth, who stood by the grand fireplace, observing the charade. "Elizabeth, dear, you're not drinking your tea," Olivia said, her voice a saccharine whisper that didn't quite mask its sharp edge. She placed a manicured hand on Elizabeth's arm, a gesture that was meant to look like comfort, but felt like a claim of ownership. "You must be absolutely exhausted. It's been such an ordeal." Elizabeth didn't answer. She just looked at the woman who was her daughter-in-law, a piranha in pearls. Olivia leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, the scent of her expensive perfume mixing with the stale air of the reception. "Once all of this is over, once everyone is gone, we'll have to figure out what to do with all this." She made a vague, sweeping gesture that encompassed the cavernous room. The priceless antiques, the legacy of a dead tyrant. Then her eyes, cold and clear as glass, settled on Elizabeth. "And you? It's a heavy burden for David to carry alone, now." Burden. The word didn't echo. It landed, a solid, cold weight in the pit of Elizabeth's stomach. It was a clinical assessment, a line item on a ledger of inconvenience. For a moment, the curated calm of the room seemed to warp around her. The murmur of conversation faded to a dull roar. She felt the delicate porcelain of the teacup in her hand, its smooth surface suddenly fragile. Her knuckles went white as her grip tightened, a silent, furious pressure. A fine spidery crack, almost invisible to the naked eye, appeared on the cup's surface, branching out from beneath her thumb. It was the only sign that Olivia's words had found their mark, not as an insult, but as a declaration of war. Olivia didn't notice. She smiled, a bright, predatory flash of teeth, and squeezed Elizabeth's arm one last time before drifting away to charm a city councilman. Elizabeth stood perfectly still, the cracked cup in her hand, and for the first time in a very, very long time, felt the slow, deep, awakening rumble of a coming storm. The scent of funeral lilies finally faded from the heavy drapes, replaced by the cloying smell of lemon polish and unspoken intent. The house, emptied of its false mourners, held its breath for a week. The silence was different now. It was no longer the oppressive silence of Richard's rule, but the tense, waiting silence before a verdict is read. The final judgment came on a Tuesday morning, in the formal living room. A space so perfectly preserved it felt as though no one had ever truly lived in it. Elizabeth sat in her usual armchair, the one with the stiff brocade that always made her feel like a visitor. Across from her, on the love seat that was never used for love, sat David and Olivia. They were a united front, a tag team of passive and active aggression. Olivia, as always, took the lead. She placed a glossy trifold brochure on the mahogany coffee table and slid it across the polished surface. The slide was a smooth, predatory sound. Silver Creek Meadows, the brochure announced in a cheerful, looping font. A premier lifestyle community. "We've been thinking, Mum," David began, his voice thick with a discomfort he couldn't hide. He stared at a point on the Persian rug, unable to meet her gaze. "This house, it's so big. The stairs, the maintenance. It's a lot for you to handle on your own." Olivia picked up the thread, her voice oozing a practiced, syrupy empathy that made Elizabeth's skin crawl. "It's not a nursing home, Elizabeth. Not really. It's a community. They have water aerobics, book clubs, chef-prepared meals. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. It would be a chance for you to downsize, to be with people your own age." She smiled, a broad, patronizing smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It would give us such peace of mind, knowing you were safe and cared for." Elizabeth said nothing. She didn't look at the brochure, with its staged photos of smiling seniors playing shuffleboard. She didn't look at her son, who was visibly squirming, a pathetic portrait of a man trying to convince himself he was doing the right thing. She just looked at Olivia, her gaze steady, unblinking. The silence stretched, becoming a tangible presence in the room. It was a weapon she had honed over 50 years, and she wielded it with an expert's precision. David cleared his throat. We could help you pack, make it easy." Olivia's patience, always a shallow reservoir, finally ran dry. The saccharine mask cracked, and the venom beneath seeped out. Her voice became sharp, brittle. "Honestly, Elizabeth, let's stop pretending this is a choice. You're dead weight in this house." David flinched, a flicker of something, shame, fear, crossing his face, but he said nothing. He did not defend his mother. Olivia pressed on, emboldened by his silence. "We can't move forward with our lives. We can't unlock this property's value while you're rattling around in it like a ghost. David has responsibilities now. He has to take charge, and this is the first step." She gestured around the room, at the gilded prison she so desperately wanted to possess. Dead weight. The phrase hung in the air, cruder than Olivia's previous jab, but far more useful. It wasn't an insult. It was a key. It was the precise combination that unlocked a vault in Elizabeth's mind, a place where 50 years of swallowed anger and silent resentment had been stored, accumulating interest. The phrase severed the last frayed thread of maternal obligation. In that moment, the man cowering on the love seat was no longer her son. He was a co-conspirator. The woman beside him was no longer her daughter-in-law. She was the enemy. She looked at David one last time, a silent appeal. She searched his eyes, not for love or loyalty, but for a single spark of protest, a shred of the boy she had raised. She found nothing, only the hollow, weak-willed reflection of his wife's ambition. He looked away. And in his cowardice, Elizabeth found her strength. The decades of practiced submission fell away like a shed skin. The fog of her gilded cage began to clear, and she saw the path forward with a breathtaking, terrifying clarity. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. Her voice, when it came, was not the voice of a defeated old woman. It was eerily calm, unnervingly level. It held a stillness that was far more menacing than any shout. "I'll think about it." They heard surrender. They heard compliance. They were fools. What they should have heard was the quiet, chilling click of a safety being released. Sleep did not come that night. The cavernous house was silent, but Elizabeth's mind was a symphony of roaring defiance. She rose from her bed, pulling on a silk robe, and began to walk. She moved through the moonlit corridors not as a resident, but as a ghost, finally confronting her own haunting. This was not a home filled with the warm patina of happy memories. It was a museum of her captivity, each object a curated exhibit of her long sentence. She ran her hand along the cold, unyielding marble of the massive fireplace in the great room. It was here Richard had entertained the city's most powerful men, with her at his side, the perfect, smiling hostess, a beautiful, silent accessory to his greatness. She touched the heavy velvet curtains, the colour of dried blood, that had been chosen to block out the prying eyes of the world, to keep the secrets in. They had also blocked out her light. She paused at the base of the grand sweeping staircase, a feature Richard had been so proud of. He had loved to watch her descend it before a party, a queen coming down to greet her court. She had always felt like a prize animal being led into the ring. Her steps were silent on the thick carpets as she moved towards the one place that had always been forbidden, Richard's study. The door had always been locked. Now it stood ajar, a silent invitation. Inside, the air was stale with the ghost of his cigars and the scent of old paper and leather. It was the command centre of his empire, and her exclusion from it had been absolute. Her hand drifted to the mantel over the study's own fireplace, her fingers tracing the intricate wood carving, and then the memory hit her. Not a gentle wave of nostalgia, but a violent, crashing breaker, pulling her under, back through the decades. The house dissolved around her. She was 30 years old again, the last embers of her youthful defiance not yet fully extinguished. Richard stood before her, not the aging patriarch from the funeral photographs, but a man in his prime, radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying power. He was not smiling. "Come with me," he'd said. It was not a request. He led her not upstairs, but down, to a part of the basement she had never seen. He unlocked a heavy, steel-reinforced door, hidden behind a rack of dusty wine bottles. The air that hit them was different. Cool, dry and soundless. He flicked a switch, and a row of recessed lights hummed to life, illuminating a scene that stole the breath from her lungs. It was a secret room, meticulously soundproofed. In the centre stood a professional-grade poker table, its green felt surface pristine. Along one wall was a fully stocked bar, and along another, hidden behind a panelled section of the wall, he showed her the safe, a massive industrial vault set directly into the foundation of the house. "This," Richard had said, his voice low and resonant in the soundless room, "is our real business, Elizabeth. The companies, the charities, the handshakes at the club, that's the stage play. This is where the real power is brokered." He gestured to the table. "The men who come here, they don't play for pocket money. They play for favours, for influence, for secrets. And sometimes they lose more than they can afford. That's when they become mine." He turned to her then, his eyes cold and hard as diamonds. He took her chin in his hand, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Your job is to be the perfect wife upstairs, to host the parties, to charm the wives, to be the living, breathing proof of my legitimacy. You are my alibi in plain sight. You will see nothing, hear nothing, and say nothing. Never forget that." He wasn't a partner confiding in his wife. He was a king instructing a subject, a warden laying down the rules of the prison. The house was his fortress, built on the ruin and debt of powerful, dangerous men, and she was its most prized, most isolated prisoner. The memory shattered, and she was back in the present, standing alone in the dark study, her hand still resting on the mantel. The past was not a ghost, it was a blueprint. The sudden rage that filled her was a physical force, a white-hot current that burned through 50 years of cold, repressed fury. It was intoxicating. It was life itself. This was not the quiet sadness of a widow or the humiliation of a mother betrayed. This was the raw, unadulterated, magnificent power of a prisoner who has just been handed the schematics to her own jail. Richard, in his supreme arrogance, had shown her everything. The foundation of his power was not in some downtown skyscraper or an offshore account. It was here, under her feet. He had thought he was showing her the steel bars of her cage. He had been a fool. He was giving her the weapons to tear it all down. She looked around the dark, silent study. The locked filing cabinets, the heavy, ornate desk, the safe in the basement. They were not monuments to his power anymore. They were tools. They were ammunition. The game had not ended with Richard's death. A new one was just beginning, and this time she would not be a pawn. She would be the queen. The morning air in Richard's study was a physical presence, thick with the ghosts of cigar smoke and 50 years of secrets. Elizabeth didn't hesitate at the threshold. She walked past the mahogany desk where the official documents lay in a neat, insulting pile, the will, the property deeds, the legal fictions that had defined her life. Her target was the wall of leather-bound books, a silent chorus of tragedies and comedies that felt more real than her own marriage. Her fingers, thin but steady, traced the gold leaf spines. Shakespeare, Dickens, Tolstoy. She ignored them all. Her destination was a specific, unassuming volume of Shakespeare's tragedies. Not King Lear, with its obvious parallels of thankless children, but a lesser-known, darker play. She pulled it. There was no loud clunk, no cinematic groan of stone, just a soft, well-oiled click. A section of the bookshelf, seamless with the rest, receded into the wall, revealing a dark, steel-lined cavity. Inside, there was no cash, no gold, no jewels. There was something far more valuable. A stack of about a dozen ledgers, their dark green covers worn at the edges, and a heavy, industrial-looking external hard drive. She lifted the top ledger. The paper was cool and brittle, the spine cracking softly as she opened it. The pages were filled with Richard's precise, angular script. It wasn't a record of his legitimate businesses. This was the real ledger, the true accounting of the Sterling Empire. Names she recognized, judges, councilmen, police chiefs, business rivals, were listed next to columns of numbers that made her breath catch. But it was the third column, labelled collateral, that held the real power. It wasn't stocks or property, it was information, a gambling addiction, a hidden child. A business deal that skirted the edge of fraud. A dark preference shared in a moment of drunken confidence during a high-stakes poker game in the basement she was never allowed to enter. This was Richard's kingdom. Not the house, not the stocks. This was it, a library of ruin. She ran a finger down a page, her touch light, almost reverent. She was not a grieving widow stumbling upon her husband's hidden life. She knew of its existence. In the abstract way one knows a storm is raging safely outside the walls of their home. But to see it, to touch it, to hold the architecture of so many men's fear in her hands, that was different. She had thought of herself as the primary prisoner of Havenwood. She now understood she was merely the warden's wife. She carried the ledgers and the hard drive to the great desk, pushing aside the meaningless will. She sat in Richard's oversized leather chair. It still smelled faintly of him. For a moment, a wave of the old, familiar powerlessness washed over her. The feeling of being small, of being an accessory. Then it passed like a fever breaking. She opened the first ledger to the first page and began to read. Hour after hour she worked. The sun arced across the sky, casting long shadows through the barred windows of the study. But she didn't notice. The house was silent, but her mind was a whirlwind of connections, a tapestry of deceit weaving itself together before her eyes. This wasn't a widow seeking comfort in her husband's memories. This was a general, long retired, studying the map of a battlefield she had just been ordered to command. And for the first time in 50 years, she felt the thrill of a coming war. A few days later, the silence of her new command centre was broken by the chime of the doorbell. It was an unwelcome intrusion, a sound from the world outside her mission. It was Leo. He stood in the doorway, his brow furrowed with a genuine concern that felt both alien and deeply touching. He was holding a greasy paper bag that smelled of fried chicken. "Hey, Grandma," he said, his voice soft. "Mum said you weren't really eating. I brought you some, well, it's not exactly health food." She managed a small, tired smile. "Leo, that's very thoughtful." He followed her into the study, his eyes widening slightly at the scene. The grand desk was no longer a polished monument to Richard Sterling. It was a war room. Ledgers were open, pages marked with small coloured tabs. And in the centre of it all was a laptop she had never used, a machine he had never seen before. It wasn't a sleek, modern MacBook or a slim Dell. It was an old Panasonic Toughbook, a hulking grey beast of a machine, built like a tank, its casing scarred and battered. It was a relic from a different era of computing, one built for durability and security, not for browsing social media. Its screen was filled with lines of text, a command line interface that looked more like something out of a 90s hacker movie than anything his grandmother should be using. "Whoa," Leo said, setting the bag of chicken down carefully on a side table. "What is that thing? Did you dig that out of the Smithsonian?" "I can get you a new one, Grandma. Something fast, with a touchscreen. We can get you set up on Instagram. You can follow your friends." "No," Elizabeth said. The word was sharper than she intended, a blade in the quiet room. "This one is fine. It does what I need it to do." She moved her hand to the mouse, her movements quick, and minimized the window. But Leo was fast. His eyes, accustomed to processing information at the speed of a thumb swipe, caught a flicker of the screen behind the black command window. It was only there for a second, but it was enough. He saw the distinctive, discreet logo of Banque Pictet, a Swiss private bank he only knew about from articles on ultra-high net worth individuals and offshore secrecy. He also saw the subject line of an email in a small notification window. Asset liquidation, Phase 1 confirmation. He said nothing. He watched his grandmother close the lid of the formidable laptop with a quiet finality. The action felt secretive, defensive. His parents had been painting a picture of a woman lost in grief, a fragile soul who couldn't manage her own affairs, who needed to be protected in a comfortable facility. But the woman in front of him, with her war room desk and her military-grade laptop accessing Swiss banks, was not that woman. Something was deeply wrong. The casual cruelty in his mother's voice when she talked about Elizabeth, the dismissive way his father waved away any questions, it all started to click into place. They weren't trying to protect her, they were trying to handle her. He stayed for another hour, making small talk, watching her pick at a piece of chicken with no real appetite. His mind, however, was racing. He was his father's son in one respect. He had a knack for seeing the vulnerabilities in a system. When he left, he didn't go straight home. He told his parents he was going to a friend's house to study. Instead, he went to a small independent electronics store downtown. He used his own money to buy a small, discreet piece of hardware, a keylogger, a physical one that plugged in between the keyboard and the USB port, almost impossible to detect with software scans. That night, long after David and Olivia were asleep, Leo crept downstairs to the family computer in the den. The house was dark, the air still. He felt a pang of guilt, a knot of unease in his stomach. This was a violation, a betrayal of his parents' trust. But the image of his grandmother, her face illuminated by the green glow of that strange laptop, pushed him forward. He saw her quiet strength and the predatory circling of his parents. He wasn't betraying them. He was trying to level a playing field he was just now beginning to understand. His fingers were quick and sure in the dim light. He unplugged the keyboard, inserted the tiny device, and plugged the keyboard back in. It took less than 10 seconds. It was a silent, digital ghost he was releasing into his own home, and he prayed it would tell him what he needed to know. He suspected his parents were hiding something from his grandmother. He had no idea it was the other way round. The next escalation came not with a whisper, but with the crisp, official rustle of expensive paper. A courier delivered a thick, cream-coloured envelope addressed to her. The letterhead was embossed with the name of a prestigious Seattle law firm, one known for its aggressive, high-price litigation. Elizabeth didn't need to open it to know what it was. It was the next predictable move on the chessboard. She took it into the study and slit the envelope open with one of Richard's old silver letter openers. The motion was precise, surgical. She unfolded the document. It was a petition to the court. The language was a masterclass in polite legal brutality. It cited her advanced age and profound grief as catalysts for a state of diminished capacity. It spoke of her inability to manage complex financial affairs and the potential for undue influence from opportunistic parties. It requested that the court grant her son, David Sterling, full and unconditional power of attorney over all her assets, her property, her very life, for her own protection and well-being. They were trying to have her declared legally incompetent, a ward of the son she had raised. It was a cage, not of steel and concrete, but of parchment and legal jargon, designed to be just as inescapable. It was an obstacle designed to strip her of any power she might have, to render her a non-entity before she could even begin to act. She read every word, her expression unreadable. She felt the insult, the sheer, breathtaking audacity of it. Olivia's fingerprints were all over the flowery, concerned language. David's weakness was in every signature line he would have to sign. They thought this would break her. They thought it would frighten the confused old woman into submission. A slow, cold smile touched Elizabeth's lips. It didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were like chips of flint. She placed the legal petition on the desk, right next to one of Richard's ledgers, opened to a page detailing the personal debts of a sitting superior court judge. They thought they were caging a dove. They had no idea. They were poking a viper with a stick. She didn't reach for the phone to call a defense attorney. Defense was a losing game. She was on the offense now. She picked up the heavy Bakelite receiver of the old landline on Richard's desk, the one with the secure, untraceable line he'd had installed decades ago. She dialed a number from memory, a number she had only ever seen written once. The phone rang 3 times before a man's voice answered, a voice as smooth and oily as expensive scotch. "Arthur Jones." "Arthur," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. There was a brief pause. "Elizabeth, my dear Elizabeth, I am so sorry for your loss. Richard was a titan, a true force of nature. I was going to call, but I wanted to give you space. If there is anything, and I mean anything, I can do to help with the estate, you just have to ask." The condescension was a thick syrup, coating every word. He saw her as a grieving, helpless widow, a loose end from Richard's life to be managed. Elizabeth let the silence hang for a moment, letting his patronising words evaporate in the dead air. "I'm looking at one of Richard's old account books, Arthur." The tone on the other end didn't change, not yet. Ah, yes, Richard was meticulous, a master of detail. He was, Elizabeth agreed coolly. For instance, I see an entry here from May 2018, a disbursement. Next to it is a name, Judge Albright, and a note, "Son's vehicular difficulties, AJ rendered final service, case dismissed for lack of evidence." Tell me, Arthur, was that you? Were you the final service? The line went utterly, profoundly silent. The professional warmth, the oily charm, it all vanished. She could hear the sound of his breathing, suddenly shallow and ragged. She had reached through the phone and squeezed his heart. The patronising lawyer was gone. In his place was a terrified man. "What do you want, Elizabeth?" His voice was strained, a wire pulled taut. The "my dear" was gone. "I don't want anything, Arthur. I am giving you instructions," she said, her voice like ice. "First, you will draft a full, unconditional transfer of deed for the Havenwood property. The grantees will be David Sterling and Olivia Sterling. Have it ready for signature by the end of the week." "Transfer the deed? Elizabeth, the tax implications alone are not your concern," she cut him off. "Second, you will locate the original mortgage agreement for this house, the one Richard set up with his investors from St. Petersburg 40 years ago. You will find clause 17B. You know the one I mean. The acceleration clause. The one that is triggered by any non-arm's-length transfer of the property under duress. You will prepare the paperwork to activate that clause the moment the new deed is filed. She could practically feel his blood run cold over the phone. He knew exactly what that clause meant. It wasn't just a financial instrument. It was a weapon of mutually assured destruction Richard had built into the foundations of his own home. "Elizabeth, you can't," he stammered. "You don't understand what you'd be unleashing. Those people, they don't send lawyers." "Oh, I understand perfectly, Arthur," she said, her voice dangerously soft. "I understand better than you can possibly imagine. Now, get to work." She hung up the phone, placing the receiver back into its cradle with a quiet, definitive click. She looked at the legal petition from David and Olivia's lawyers, a cage for a dove. She almost laughed. The viper was out, and it was ready to strike. Her work wasn't finished. The Ledgers and Arthur Jones were the cannons, but a successful campaign required precision munitions. She needed something personal, something that would strike not at finance, but at the heart. While cross-referencing names from the Ledgers with online property records on her tough book, her gaze fell upon a dusty shelf in the corner of the study. It was a graveyard of discarded technology, old phones, cameras, and an iPad. It was Olivia's old one, a model from 3 or 4 years ago, abandoned when she'd upgraded to the latest version. A loose end. Olivia, in her arrogance, was careless. Elizabeth picked it up. The screen was smudged with fingerprints, but a press of the home button brought it to life. The battery was still half full. She swiped to unlock it. Olivia hadn't even bothered to set a passcode. And there, on the home screen, were the familiar grid of apps: mail, photos, and a small blue and white icon for a cloud storage service, the family's shared account. Elizabeth tapped it. The app opened without asking for a password. Olivia was still logged in. A cold, methodical calm settled over Elizabeth. She was not a jealous wife snooping on a cheating husband. She was an intelligence analyst searching for a weakness in the enemy's defenses. She bypassed the shared family folders, vacation photos, tax documents. She navigated to the folders accessible only by Olivia's profile. Most were innocuous: shopping receipts, screenshots of recipes. Then she saw it. A folder cryptically named Future Plans. Her finger hovered over it for a second, then tapped. Inside was a hidden world of breathtaking deceit. It wasn't a holiday itinerary. It was an escape plan. There were hotel receipts from boutique hotels in the city, booked for 2, on dates when David had supposedly been working late. The second guest's name was a prominent local real estate developer, a man whose name she'd seen Olivia mention with a little too much enthusiasm. There were screenshots of text message conversations, a river of saccharine lies and whispered promises, filled with shared contempt for the dead weight of the family, a term that apparently included both her and David. But the real treasure, the payload, was in a subfolder labelled Contingency. Inside were PDFs of bank statements, an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, under a shell corporation with a meaningless name, and a log of wire transfers. Small amounts at first, a few $1,000s here and there, siphoned from David's consulting business account under vague invoices for marketing services and client relations. Over the past 18 months, the amounts had grown larger. Olivia wasn't just having an affair. She was systematically gutting her husband's company. She was planning to take the windfall from the sale of the house, combine it with the money she'd already stolen, and vanish, leaving David with a failed business and a mountain of debt. Elizabeth felt no shock, no outrage, only a cold, clarifying focus. This wasn't a personal betrayal to her. It was a strategic asset. She calmly found a USB-C to USB-A adapter in Richard's desk drawer and connected the iPad to her tough book. A small window popped up on her screen. "Trust this computer?" She tapped Trust on the iPad screen. Then, with the methodical precision of a librarian archiving a priceless manuscript, She began to download everything, every text message, every hotel receipt, every single damning bank statement. The green progress bar moved slowly across her screen, a silent, steady fuse being lit. Olivia's treachery wasn't a complication to her plan. It was the final, devastating weapon she needed. It was the checkmate. She now had the means to destroy not only their finances, but the very foundation of their relationship. She had the power to turn them on each other, to let their own greed and betrayal consume them from the inside out. When the download was complete, she disconnected the iPad, wiped her fingerprints from its screen, and placed it back on the dusty shelf exactly as she had found it. A ghost in the machine had given her the last piece of the puzzle. The unravelling was complete. Now it was time to start weaving the net. The clinking of silver on porcelain was the only sound for a long moment, a delicate, rhythmic percussion in the vast, silent dining room of Havenwood. The scent of roasted rosemary and garlic hung in the air, a ghost of a meal meticulously prepared, a final act of domesticity that felt more like a prelude to a ritual. Elizabeth sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her spine straight, a serene, almost beatific smile playing on her lips. It was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, those pale blue irises that held the deep, placid cold of a winter lake. Across from her, David shifted in his chair, the fabric of his expensive suit rustling. He kept glancing at his wife, Olivia, then back to his mother, a nervous tick in his jaw, betraying his attempt at a confident, magnanimous air. He and Olivia had arrived an hour ago, their faces masks of smug victory. They believed this dinner was a formality, a quiet surrender. The legal petitions for conservatorship, the letters from their lawyer citing her cognitive decline and inability to manage her affairs, had done their work, they thought. Her silence over the past week was to them a white flag. Leo, sitting to his grandmother's right, was a statue of teenage apprehension. He picked at a loose thread on his napkin, his eyes darting between his parents and Elizabeth. He felt it, the thing his parents were too arrogant to notice. A tension coiling in the room, tight as a watch spring, emanating from the calm, smiling woman at the head of the table. This wasn't surrender. This was something else entirely. Olivia dabbed her lips with a linen napkin, a gesture of performative elegance. She set it down and gave Elizabeth a condescendingly bright smile. "The lamb was simply divine, Elizabeth," she said, her voice smooth and patronizing. "Truly, you've always had such a knack for it." She paused, letting the compliment hang in the air before twisting the knife. "But you see, this is exactly what I mean. You won't have to trouble yourself with all this anymore. They have a wonderful chef at Silver Creek Meadows. I read the reviews online, 5 stars. You'll be so well taken care of." David nodded eagerly, jumping in to support his wife. "She's right, Mother. It's about time you let someone else do the work. Time for you to relax. You've earned it." He said the words like a benediction, a gift he was bestowing upon her. Elizabeth's smile didn't waver. She reached for the deep red bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon, her hand steady, a lifetime of suppressed tremors now completely absent. The wine glugged into Olivia's glass, a rich, blood-dark stream. "More wine, Olivia?" Elizabeth asked, her voice soft, melodic. "We should celebrate. New beginnings, after all." Olivia held up her glass, her triumphant smile widening. "To new beginnings," she echoed, her eyes meeting David's over the rim of her glass, a silent, shared toast to their inheritance. Leo watched his grandmother. He saw the way her fingers rested on the stem of her own glass, the way her gaze lingered on Olivia's face for a fraction of a second too long. It wasn't the look of a defeated old woman. It was the look of a predator, patiently watching its prey walk deeper into the trap. They finished the dessert, a simple but elegant chocolate lava cake. Elizabeth had insisted on serving everything herself, refusing any help from Olivia, who had offered with a sigh that suggested the effort was far too much for a woman in her condition. The plates were cleared, scraped clean by David and Olivia, who ate with the ravenous satisfaction of people who believed they had just closed the deal of a lifetime. Leo had barely touched his. The rich chocolate tasted like ash in his mouth. Elizabeth let the silence settle again, a thick, heavy blanket. She folded her hands on the polished table, her demeanour that of a CEO about to begin a board meeting. David cleared his throat, ready to prompt her, to ask for the signed papers he expected her to produce. But she spoke first. Her voice, no longer soft, cut through the quiet air with the clean, sharp edge of glass. You wanted the house, David. It wasn't a question. It was the statement of fact. She looked directly at her son, her gaze unblinking. For the first time that evening, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. This wasn't the tone of a woman surrendering. From a small side table next to her chair, she lifted a thick, burgundy-coloured legal folder. It was heavy, packed with documents. It landed on the table with a solid, definitive thud that made both David and Olivia jump. With 2 fingers, she slid it across the polished wood. It glided silently, smoothly, stopping directly in front of David. It's yours, she said. David stared at the folder, then at his mother. What is this? What you wanted, Elizabeth replied, her voice even. Everything you wanted. Olivia leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with greed. The papers. You're signing it over? Oh, Elizabeth, that's so sensible of you. Truly, it's for the best. David, his confidence returning, smirked. He pulled the folder towards him and untied the silk ribbon, holding it closed. He expected to see the standard agreement their lawyer had drafted, the one that would place her assets under his control before her move to Silver Creek. He flipped open the cover. The first document on top was a deed to the Havenwood estate. He scanned it, his eyes widening slightly. It was a full, legally executed transfer of ownership, not a conservatorship. Not a trust. A complete, irrevocable transfer. His name, David Sterling, and Olivia Sterling's name were listed as the new owners. It was signed, dated, and notarized. He let out a low whistle. My God, he breathed, a giddy laugh escaping him. She actually did it. She just gave it to us. Olivia snatched the paper from him, her eyes devouring the text. Free and clear. Oh, David, we did it. She was practically vibrating with excitement, her mind already calculating the property's market value, the renovations, the prestige. They were no longer just living in Richard Sterling's house, they owned it. David thumbed past the deed, expecting more of the same. But the next document was different. It was thicker, printed on a different type of paper, stark and official. At the top, in bold, unforgiving letters, were the words, Mortgage Acceleration Notice. His smile froze, then vanished. He read the first line, then he read it again. The words blurred, refusing to make sense. He felt a cold knot form in the pit of his stomach. What is this? He whispered, his voice cracking. He pushed the document toward Olivia, his hand trembling slightly. Olivia, read this. Olivia, still basking in the glow of the deed, took the notice with an annoyed huff. Her eyes scanned the page, the colour drained from her face, her perfectly painted lips parted in a silent O of disbelief. The notice was from a private financial entity she'd never heard of, J Corp Holdings, and it was brutal in its clarity. The entire remaining balance on the Havenwood estate mortgage, a staggering sum of $4.7 million, was now due, in full. Payment required within 30 days. 30 days? Olivia shrieked, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. $4 million? This is insane! The mortgage payments are current. We checked. They were, Elizabeth said calmly, taking a slow sip of her wine. But your father was a very particular man. Mr. Jones, his lawyer, was equally particular. They like to build contingencies into their agreements. David was frantically flipping through the rest of the paperwork, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He found the original mortgage contract, a document yellowed with age, signed by his father 50 years ago. And there, circled in red ink by a hand he did not recognise, was Clause 11b, the acceleration clause. It was triggered by a number of events, but one stood out, a phrase he had never seen in any legal document before. Ownership transfer under duress. Duress? David sputtered, slamming his fist on the table. The water glasses jumped. What duress? You gave it to us. We didn't force you. Didn't you? Elizabeth asked, her eyebrows arching in mock surprise. Let's see. You hired a lawyer. You filed a petition with the court claiming I was mentally incompetent. You threatened to strip me of my legal rights and seize control of my assets if I didn't comply with your demand to be moved into an assisted living facility. You called me a dead weight that needed to be disposed of so you could exploit the value of the house. If that isn't duress, David, I'm not sure what is. Mr. Jones was quite confident it would meet the legal definition. He was very thorough. The name hit David like a physical blow. Arthur Jones? You spoke to Dad's lawyer? I did more than speak to him, Elizabeth said. I instructed him. The rage on David's face curdled into a new, more potent emotion, fear. Arthur Jones wasn't just a lawyer. He was Richard Sterling's fixer. A man who operated in the deepest, greyest shadows of the law. If Jones was involved, this wasn't a mistake. It was a precision-guided missile. This is some kind of joke, David stammered, his voice losing its force. A sick, twisted joke. You can't do this. We'll fight this. We'll go to the bank. Oh, it's no joke, David, Elizabeth said, her voice dropping, losing its feigned lightness and taking on the hard, cold density of granite. She reached for the side table again and produced a second folder, this one black and unmarked. She slid it across the table. It came to a stop next to the first. You won't be going to a bank. You'll be going to them. She tapped the black folder with a single manicured finger. That, she said, is your true inheritance. With dread-filled fingers, David opened the second folder. Inside were not legal documents, but photocopies. Pages upon pages from what looked like old accounting ledgers, filled with handwritten notes and figures that made no sense. And on top, another notarized document from Arthur Jones. It wasn't a transfer of property. It was a transfer of operational control of Richard Sterling's private asset management business to his sole heir, David Sterling. I don't understand, David said, his mind reeling. Dad's business was in real estate development. Elizabeth let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of any humour. That was his hobby, David. The business that paid for all this was something else entirely. Your father didn't build this house with bank loans. He built it with other people's money. Very dangerous people's money. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. The mortgage wasn't with a bank. Havenwood isn't just a house, it's a financial instrument. It was a laundering mechanism, a way for your father's, quote, silent partners to move their money into the legitimate world. The monthly payments you saw weren't for interest and principal. They were service fees. Payments to the people who really owned him. And by extension, this house. She paused, letting the horror sink in. J Corp Holdings isn't a corporation. It's a shell, a name on a piece of paper. The real creditors, they don't have offices, they have territories. Let me name a few for you. Her voice was now a clinical, dispassionate whisper. One of them is a man in Moscow named Valentin Kozlov. He used to be with the KGB. Your father helped him move his fortune out of Russia after the Union fell. Mr. Kozlov doesn't like his investments to be disturbed. I once heard your father on the phone after one of Kozlov's couriers had a little car trouble. They didn't find the car for a week. They never found the courier. David's face had gone from pale to a sickly greenish white. He looked like he was going to be sick. Then there's the Sinaloa contingent, Elizabeth continued, her voice relentless. A man they call El Martillo, the Hammer. Your father's poker games downstairs weren't just for fun. They were the primary washing machine for half the drug trade on the West Coast. El Martillo was your father's biggest client. And his most volatile. He doesn't believe in late fees, David. He believes in making examples. She sat back in her chair, the picture of composure. Those men, and a half-dozen others like them, were your father's creditors. And now, thanks to that notarized transfer of control you're holding, they are yours. You haven't inherited a home, David. You've inherited a criminal enterprise, a mountain of dirty money, and a death sentence. The 30-day clock isn't from a bank threatening foreclosure, it's from them. They are giving you 1 month to make them whole, to pay back the full value of their laundered capital. If you sell the house, you might get close, but where do you think that money goes? And if you miss the payment... She let the sentence hang in the air. They won't send lawyers, they'll send collectors, men who don't use paperwork. She added one final, chilling detail. The FBI has had an open file on this house for 20 years. They have surveillance photos, they have informants, but they could never get past your father. He was too insulated, too powerful. I wonder how you'll fare. The room was utterly silent, save for the sound of David's ragged, panicked breathing. He was staring at the black folder as if it were a venomous snake. The house, his prize, his symbol of status, had transformed in an instant into a gilded cage, a prison with the most brutal wardens in the world. Suddenly, Olivia erupted. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. Her face was a mask of pure, primal panic. "No!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Elizabeth. "This is insane! You're insane! You tricked us! We want no part of this! This is your husband's filth! Your family's problem! Not mine. David, tell her. We refuse. She turned on her husband, her eyes wild. This is your inheritance, David, not mine. My name is on that deed, but I had nothing to do with this. I want my name off it. Now. You have to fix this. This is your mess. Elizabeth watched the frantic, self-serving display with a kind of detached pity. She let Olivia's tirade run its course, a flurry of accusations and denials that filled the cavernous room. She waited until Olivia was breathless, her hands clutching her hair. Then, slowly, Elizabeth reached for one last item on the side table. It was a small, slim envelope, cream-coloured and elegant. It bore no name. She slid it across the table, not to David, but directly to Olivia. It stopped in front of her wine-glass. I believe you have your own exit strategy, my dear, Elizabeth said, her voice now impossibly sweet, a horrifying parody of her earlier tone. Perhaps it's time you used it. Olivia stared at the envelope, her chest heaving. With a shaking hand, she snatched it up and tore it open. There was no letter inside, just a single sheet of glossy photo paper. She looked down. Her breath caught in her throat. A choked, strangled sound. It was a bank statement. A printout from an account at a private bank in the Cayman Islands. An account in her name only, containing a very substantial 6-figure sum. And tucked behind it was a photograph. A candid, clear shot of her, laughing, on the balcony of a hotel room in Cabo San Lucas. Her arms wrapped around a man who was most definitely not her husband. She looked up at Elizabeth, her face a canvas of utter defeat. The fight, the panic, the fury, it all drained away, leaving behind a hollow, empty shell. She was caught. She was exposed. She was finished. Leo had watched the entire exchange with a dawning horror that slowly transformed into a stunned, breathtaking awe. He looked at his father, a broken man, white-faced and trembling, staring at a future of unimaginable terror. He looked at his mother, frozen, a piece of paper in her hand that had just dismantled her entire life. And then he looked at his grandmother. She was no longer the frail, quiet, burdensome old woman. She was a queen who had been trapped on the board for 50 years, a prisoner in her own castle. And in one single, brilliant, ruthless move, she had just sacrificed her entire kingdom, the house, the money, the legacy, to checkmate the petty king and queen who had sought to depose her. Elizabeth stood up. Her back, which had been stooped for as long as Leo could remember, was now ramrod straight. The weight of decades seemed to have lifted from her shoulders. She walked, not to the grand staircase, but to the hall closet by the front door. She opened it and retrieved a small, pre-packed carry-on bag. It was black, simple, and ready. She walked to the front door, her heels clicking decisively on the marble floor. She paused with her hand on the ornate brass handle, but didn't turn around. She didn't need to see the wreckage she was leaving behind. She could feel it. I believe the term you used was dead weight, Olivia, she said, her voice carrying clearly back into the dining room, each word a perfectly placed stone on a grave. The weight is now all yours. She opened the door, stepped out into the cool night air, and closed it softly behind her. She didn't look back. The air in the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was thin and recycled, smelling faintly of burnt coffee, industrial cleaner, and the vague, anxious sweat of 1,000 different journeys. It was a cathedral of transience, a place where no one belonged and everyone was simply passing through. For Elizabeth, it was the perfect sanctuary. She sat at a gate overlooking the tarmac, a ghost in a sea of anonymous faces. Outside the immense plate glass window, the sky was just beginning to bleed from bruised purple into a soft, promising grey. Dawn was breaking over the Cascades, silhouetting the wings of sleeping giants lined up on the runway. Each one a promise of escape, a promise she was about to collect. She had chosen her seat carefully, away from the chattering families and the frantic businessmen hammering on their keyboards. She was in a small alcove next to a charging station, an old woman in a simple, comfortable pantsuit, the kind of person you'd glance at and immediately forget. It was a role she had perfected over 50 years, the wallpaper of a person. Unseen, unremarkable, utterly underestimated. From her carry-on, a bag that was neither new nor old, she retrieved not the well-worn paperback one might expect, but a laptop. It was impossibly thin, a blade of matte black magnesium alloy, cold and severe to the touch. It had no logos, no distinguishing marks. It was a sterile instrument of devastating precision. She had purchased it 2 years ago, using a shell corporation she'd set up in the late 90s, and had it delivered to a P.O. box in a different state. It had never once been connected to the Wi-Fi at Havenwood. It was a digital ghost, just like the woman who owned it. She opened it. The machine came to life without a sound, the screen glowing with a simple text-based operating system. No friendly icons, no welcoming chimes, just a blinking cursor in a black void, waiting for a command. Her fingers, which David and Olivia probably imagined were gnarled with arthritis and capable only of clutching a teacup, moved with a fluid, practiced certainty across the keyboard. She typed a password that was not a word, but a complex alphanumeric string, a sequence of numbers tied to the dates of Richard's most egregious betrayals. A small, private monument to her pain, now repurposed as the key to her liberation. The screen flickered, and a new interface appeared. It was the portal to a private bank in Zurich, an institution so discreet it made its competitors look like tabloid newspapers. The interface was stark, secure, and utterly impersonal. Blue and white, clean lines, nothing to distract from the numbers. And the numbers were breathtaking. For a moment, she didn't do anything. She just looked at the primary figure displayed at the top of the screen, her balance. It wasn't Richard's money. He would have been horrified to know it even existed. No, this was hers. She had earned it. She had levied it. It was a 50-year severance package she had paid herself. It had started small, a quiet act of defiance in the second decade of her marriage. Richard, in his magnanimous tyranny, had given her a household budget. A generous one, to be sure. He liked to boast about it. But he also demanded meticulous records. He would review the ledgers himself, a king surveying his domestic treasury. He never noticed the rounding errors. A few cents here, $1 there. He was looking for large-scale theft, for a betrayal on his own scale. He couldn't conceive of a war of attrition fought with pennies. Those pennies became her seed money. She had learned about the stock market not from financial papers, but from the scraps of conversation she overheard at Richard's parties. While she was playing the perfect hostess, refilling drinks and smiling blandly, she was listening. She heard a name, Intel, in the early 80s, whispered between two of Richard's more forward-thinking associates, a company making tiny chips for a new kind of machine. Using her grocery money, she'd bought a handful of shares through a broker she'd found in the phone book under her maiden name, a name Richard had tried to erase from existence. The Intel money became the Microsoft money. The Microsoft money became the Amazon money. She was always a decade ahead of Richard, who was still mired in the old-world brutalities of real estate, intimidation, and illicit games of chance. He built his empire with a sledgehammer. She built hers with a microchip. Later, her methods became bolder. As Richard's illegal poker games grew in scale and frequency, so did the river of cash flowing through the house. He trusted her to handle the domestic accounts, to pay the caterers, the cleaners, the landscapers. All the mundane expenses beneath his notice. He never realized she was skimming. A forged invoice for a garden party that never happened. An inflated bill for champagne. She created a phantom layer of expenses, a ghost budget that mirrored the real one and siphoned off the difference. It was a tyranny tax, she called it, in the privacy of her own mind. A surcharge for the years of her life he had consumed. She had learned his systems, his patterns, his blind spots. He was a creature of habit, arrogant in his belief that he controlled every variable. He never imagined the quiet woman who brought him his evening scotch was also the architect of a silent, parallel financial empire, built from the scraps he let fall from his table. He saw a domestic servant. He never saw the accountant. The money sat in Switzerland, growing, compounding, waiting. It was her secret garden, a place of silent, ferocious hope in the middle of a barren wasteland. It was the proof that even in the most suffocating of prisons, a mind could still be free. It was the promise she made to the young woman she had been, the one who had walked into Havenwood full of life and had it slowly, systematically drained from her. Now it was time to move it. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She wasn't just transferring funds, she was performing the final rites for Elizabeth Sterling.
She initiated a multi-stage liquidation of her assets, stocks, bonds, digital currencies she'd invested in long before they became a mainstream mania.
The system, designed by her, for her, worked flawlessly. The assets were sold through a cascade of anonymous exchanges across different jurisdictions. The proceeds converted into a stable, untraceable cryptocurrency, then funneled through a series of digital mixers that tumbled the transaction history into incomprehensible chaos. It was the digital equivalent of laundering money through a dozen different countries in the span of 30 seconds. What emerged on the other side was clean, sterile, and completely disconnected from its origins. The final step was the transfer to a new account, an account she had established last week under a new name. Not just a new name, but a new identity. Complete with a passport and driver's license from a country known for its flexible citizenship by investment programs. A country that didn't ask too many questions. Her new name was Helena Carvalho. Helena after her own grandmother, a woman who had been a force of nature. And Carvalho, a common Portuguese surname. It sounded like the sea. It sounded like freedom. She typed in the routing numbers, the account details, the final destination. Her finger hovered over the enter key. This was it, the point of no return. 50 years of silence, of planning, of enduring, all culminating in this single silent keystroke. She thought of David's face at the dinner table, so full of weak, borrowed arrogance. She thought of Olivia's triumphant smirk, the look of a predator who believes its prey has finally surrendered. They thought they were caging a feeble old woman. They had no idea they were simply opening the door for the Queen to walk off the board, leaving them to play a losing game against the monsters she had sicked on them. The house, the business, the debt. It was a perfectly constructed trap. A legacy of ruin. Richard had built a prison of greed and fear, and she had just handed the keys to his unworthy heirs. They wouldn't last 6 months. The partners Richard had dealt with, the cold-eyed men from Moscow, the smiling, ruthless emissaries of the cartels, they did not send lawyers when a debt went unpaid. They sent collectors. David and Olivia thought they had inherited a mansion. They had inherited a death sentence. A small, cold smile touched her lips. She pressed the key. A simple dialogue box appeared on the screen. Transaction complete. It was done. Elizabeth Sterling, the wife, the mother, the widow, was now nothing more than a ghost in the machine, a collection of deleted files. The vast fortune she had meticulously cultivated was now the property of Helena Carvalho, a woman who did not yet exist anywhere but in a Swiss bank's database and on a plane ticket in her purse. She closed the laptop, the silent click of the lid like the closing of a coffin. She slipped it back into her bag, just another anonymous traveller with a piece of luggage. She felt light. The weight of 50 years, the crushing burden of Richard's name, the suffocating presence of Havenwood, it had all evaporated in that single silent transaction. Just as she settled back into her seat, a vibration against her leg startled her. Her phone. The burner phone she'd bought for the final phase of her plan. She had intended to just discard it, but she pulled it out. A single text message glowed on the screen. It was from Leo. "Grandma, are you safe?" Her breath caught in her throat. Leo. The boy with the kind eyes and the quiet intelligence that reminded her so much of herself. He was the only collateral damage in her war, the one piece of her old life that caused a genuine, sharp pang of regret. He hadn't deserved to be caught in the blast radius of his parents' greed. He was the one person who had looked at her and seen a grandmother, not a burden or a dead weight. He had seen her. She looked at the message. The simple, heartfelt words, "Are you safe?" He wasn't asking about the money or the house. He was asking about her. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to drop the phone in the trash as planned and sever the final thread. But she couldn't. That would be a cruelty worthy of Richard. Leo deserved an answer. He deserved a compass. Her thumbs, surprisingly nimble, moved over the tiny virtual keyboard. She typed, deleted, and rephrased, choosing her words with the care of a poet composing a final couplet. She couldn't tell him everything, but she could give him one last gift, a piece of the truth, a direction. For the first time in 50 years, I am. She let the words sink in. The truth of them was a physical sensation, a warmth spreading through her chest. She was safe. Safe from Richard's ghost. Safe from David's weakness. Safe from Olivia's venom. Safe from the gilded cage she had called home for a lifetime. She continued typing. Your father chose his path. Be a better man. It was everything she could give him. A warning, a plea, and an absolution. It released him from any obligation to his father's legacy. It was permission to forge his own destiny, to break the chain of toxicity that had defined the Sterling men. It was the most honest, loving thing she had said to a member of her family in decades. She pressed send. The message disappeared into the ether. Then, with a decisive finality, she powered down the phone. She popped the back cover off, her fingernail finding the small groove. She slid out the SIM card, a tiny fleck of plastic and gold that held all the data, all the connections, all the history of her final days as Elizabeth Sterling. She held it between her thumb and forefinger. It felt like nothing. It weighed nothing. Yet it was the anchor to a life of immense, suffocating weight. She stood up and walked to the nearby trash receptacle. It had a swinging metal flap. She pushed it open and dropped the SIM card inside. She didn't hear it land. It was simply gone, erased. She returned to her seat. The performance was over. The humiliation of her departure, the staged surrender, the quiet, defeated exit from Havenwood. It had been the role of a lifetime. Olivia and David saw a pathetic old woman being carted off to a nursing home. They saw a victory. They were fools. She hadn't been cast out. She had been liberated. She had orchestrated her own magnificent escape. And they had paid for the ticket. They had paid for everything. A calm, disembodied voice echoed through the terminal. Good morning, passengers. We are now inviting those in groups 1 and 2 to begin boarding flight TP237 with service to Lisbon. Lisbon. The city of 7 hills, overlooking the vast, endless Atlantic. A place she'd only read about in books, dreaming of it in the dead of night while Richard snored beside her. A city of explorers and poets. A city on the edge of the old world, looking out toward the new. It was perfect. Helena Carvalho stood up. She smoothed the front of her simple, elegant pantsuit. She picked up her carry-on bag, which felt impossibly light. She didn't look back. There was nothing behind her but ghosts, and they were trapped in a prison of their own making. She walked toward the gate, her steps steady and even. She joined the line of passengers, just another face in the crowd. Her heart calm, her mind clear. She handed her ticket and her new passport to the gate agent, who smiled and waved her through. As she stepped into the jet bridge, the first rays of the morning sun finally broke free of the mountains, flooding the tarmac with a brilliant golden light. It was a new sunrise. And for the first time in 50 years, she was walking toward it, free.